let's watch a video about the Bronze Age. Um, yeah. So the Bronze Age collapsed approximately 1200 B.C.E. By Historia Civilis 4 years ago. I probably know some stuff, but if you just tell me like Bronze Age like that, I don't really know what you mean.
Sometime around the year 1200 BCE, human civilization did an oopsie.
Okay.
Within the short span of one generation, the majority of Earth's most technologically advanced civilizations faced an existential crisis. Nearly all of them failed the test. The resulting collapse was a turning point in human history, similar in scope to the collapse of the Roman Empire. The old world died, and the Bronze Age died with it.
Alright then, tell me about it. Tell me what the mistake was.
The odd thing is that we barely understand why this happened. There are a bunch of theories, but nothing definitive. We'll get into that in a moment, but first, an introduction.
What is the Bronze Age?
When the Bronze Age began in Western Asia, it brought to an end an old world of tiny city-states, ruled by an oppressive class of totalitarian priests. The new world that came after was one full of possibilities. Vast, sweeping empires grew up seemingly out of nowhere. New religions, new systems of government, new cultures, new technology, all at once, all at a breakneck pace. Revolutions in farming led to massive food surpluses, which in turn allowed for these huge, bustling, multicultural cities. These new cities participated in a dynamic system of international trade, totally unlike the cloistered city-states that preceded them.
So everything was great for a while.
By the late Bronze Age, the big players were Egypt, Cyprus, the Mycenaeans, the Hittite Empire, Assyria, and Babylonia. Each of these states, without exception, faced an existential crisis around the year 1200 BCE. Within a generation, most of them were gone.
What would it be though?
Here's what we know. Sometime around the beginning of the 12th century, the king of Ugarit, a city in the Hittite Empire, wrote a letter to the king of Cyprus. My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. Doesn't my father know that all of my infantry and chariots are stationed in Kat, and that all of my ships are stationed in the land of Luca?
So yes, the defense
was another name for the Hittite capital, several hundred kilometers inland. Luca was several hundred kilometers to the west, on the Aegean coast. They have not arrived back yet, and so the land is thus prostrate, defenseless.
Sad.
May my father be aware of this matter. Now the 7 ships of the enemy which have been coming have done harm to us.
Just 7 ships?
Now if other ships of the enemy turn up, send me a report somehow so that I will know.
Okay. I like the way this is written. I mean, obviously this is translated for an ancient language, but it's like half super polite and half kind of casual. It's weird.
Promised to send the king of Ugarit reinforcements, but it was too late. The last known letter to leave Ugarit reads, "When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated and the city was sacked.
Damn.
Our food in the threshing floors was burnt,
Is it
and
the
the
Mongols?
vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked.
Might it be the
May
Mongols?
you know it.
I don't know.
May you know it."
The Vikings? Who done it?
The king of Cyprus was well aware of what was happening on the mainland, but he had problems of his own. Cyprus was under attack at the same time. Several larger cities, especially on the western coast, were burned, and many of the smaller cities, further inland, were simply abandoned. Wealthy residents buried their valuables, with plans to return once the crisis had blown over. They never returned.
Okay. But who done it?
Things were different in Greece. For the last 100 years, the Mycenaeans had been plagued by internal instability. There are signs of destruction everywhere. The ruins of these cities leave evidence of massive fires, intermixed with arrowheads and weapons, which paints a pretty clear picture of a series of battles in which the defenders were ultimately defeated. Other cities leave evidence of smaller fires, confined solely to the palace structures in the center of the cities. This indicates some kind of popular uprising in which local kings were overthrown, not just in one city, but in many cities.
I guess revolution
other
has always been a
cities
thing.
show signs of being abandoned, either because of famine or natural disaster, or both. On the whole, the picture is fuzzy, but it's fair to say that there was chaos in Greece.
Nothing new. The Hittite
It was
Empire.
even worse in Anatolia, the homeland of the Hittites.
Never heard that
Archaeological
before.
evidence suggests that every major city in Anatolia may have been at least partially destroyed during this period. This
Damn.
was especially true up and down the coast. In fact, we now know that the city of Troy was destroyed at this time. Recent archaeological digs there have found arrowheads still lodged in the ruined walls of a city, and evidence of a fire.
A lot of arrows, a lot of
Further
fires.
inland, things get a little more mysterious. The Hittite capital, which only a few years earlier was being protected by the king of Ugarit's army, was largely abandoned. It would later be stormed and burned, just like all the others.
So I guess there was no writing at the time about like what was happening. So we're all guessing what happened.
For a long time, this abrupt, region-wide collapse was inexplicable. Historians knew that it happened, but they couldn't tell you how or why. But in the second half of the 19th century, Egyptian archaeological discoveries provided a hair-raising and revolutionary explanation for this mysterious collapse.
I was gonna say, like, maybe it's just that, you know, because everybody got super friendly and all about, you know, like, trading and all that, they didn't really care much about armies or defense or all that. And maybe some external force just came in and there was nothing to really stand in our way. I don't know.
This inscription was discovered in an Egyptian temple in Medinet Habu.
Rival of Egypt.
It changed our understanding of the late Bronze Age forever. Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III describes several waves of foreign invaders arriving on the shores of Egypt over the course of 30 years. The inscription at Medinet Habu reads, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. They laid their hands on the land as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts confident and trusting. Our plans will succeed." The Egyptians had some guesses as to who these invaders were, but they couldn't be certain. Historians have simply taken to calling them the Sea Peoples.
Sea People.
We now think that the Sea Peoples were a loose coalition of groups from all across the Mediterranean. We can't be 100% sure of this, but we can say with some confidence that most of them were from Sicily, Sardinia, Crete, and the Aegean coast. Maybe some other places too. Some wore feathered headdresses, while others wore horned helmets or simple leather caps. Some wore kilts, while others wore tunics.
So I guess it really wasn't like some massive, like, other country trying to just, you know, pillage and loot all over the place. It was probably just a lot of, like, random, you know, bandit groups, pirate bands, maybe some small army from here and there. But again, I guess, yeah, like, all those countries had, like, no armies or anything to defend themselves, which surprised me, but fair enough.
Some went into battle wearing full body armor, while others fought shirtless. What united these groups was their reason
It means
for
you're way stronger
coming.
if you're shirtless.
This was a migration. We know that they came on boats and on wagons, with their families and all of their worldly possessions. What brought them here is another question that we'll get into later. By the time the Sea Peoples finally arrived in Egypt, virtually every other Bronze Age civilization had been overrun. The Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, Canaan in the Levant, Cyprus in Cyprus, all gone. Some states further inland were less affected by the invasions, but they were so weakened by the collapse of their neighbors that their days were numbered as well. When the Sea Peoples began their migration, they couldn't have imagined that it would have been this successful. All the way up until Egypt, every attempt to resist them failed. Why? In order to understand this, we need to talk about Bronze Age warfare.
Chariots.
Chariots, chariots, chariots.
Hmm.
Bronze Age warfare in Western Asia was all about chariots.
Okay.
In the early Bronze Age, they were primarily used for transportation, but by the Intermediate Bronze Age, the militaries of every major state in the region were completely designed around the use of the chariot. A chariot of this period usually consisted of a team of 2 horses pulling a team of 2 humans.
It's really one of these things where like chariots are pretty interesting like weapon of history, but when you think about it, they seem so, I don't know how good they actually were, but to me they seem like they weren't very good. Like it seems not that hard to deal with them. You know, it can't be that precise to really drive it with 2 horses. It can be pretty easy to probably kill the horse and just stop the thing. You know, anyone trying to like be an archer on top of the carriage, it must be pretty hard to hit anybody while you're just driving super fast. I don't know, like this seems super easy to deal with. In my head at least. Yeah.
Driver and 1 archer. The humans, I mean. The horses and the driver were trained for speed and maneuverability, and at full speed could move roughly twice as fast as a human could run.
Too small to be
The
brought into
archer
battle.
wielded a composite
interesting.
bow, not as clumsy or random as a regular bow. It was smaller and lighter, with better accuracy, range, and firepower. It was a state-of-the-art piece of technology. In this period, it could punch through roughly 3 inches of metal.
Damn.
So a full chariot team had everyone else beat when it came to speed, range, and firepower.
Just get some
This is
skills.
a bit of a tangent, but it's said that the moment the HMS Dreadnought touched water in the year 1906, every other ship in the ocean became obsolete. The
Okay.
HMS Dreadnought was the best in the world when it came to speed, range,
British
and
has too.
firepower, which meant that it could just sit back and pick off enemy ships at a distance, and then outrun anybody who came too close. Like the Dreadnought, Bronze Age chariots had speed, range, and firepower. Like the Dreadnought, they could just sit back and pick off enemies at a distance. Like the
I see.
Dreadnought, they could outrun anybody who came too close.
So they don't actually charge, okay.
An
Okay,
experienced group of chariots were capable of defeating an army 10 times its size.
Really?
This revolutionized Bronze Age warfare.
I can't imagine how silly that must look. Like, you've got this massive army trying to walk toward the chariots, and they're just kind of like, we have the faraway weapon, so you can't do anything. That sounds really silly, and they just keep like retreating while shooting them and getting them one by one by one by one. Like, a battle of this kind must have been really, really silly to watch.
But they were expensive as hell. Horses had to be specifically bred and trained, which cost a small fortune. The equipment was all handcrafted by artisans, and
Mongol or
cost
Sartre.
at least twice as much as the horses did.
Yeah, but
The loss
you get way more maneuverability, right, when you're directly on the horse itself, right? Compared to a chariot, like a metal chariot.
A single chariot was catastrophic, and so chariots went into battle with thousands of inexpensive spearmen and archers deployed in a defensive line. The infantry could protect friendly chariots that needed to repair or regroup, or they could rush forward and destroy enemy chariots that were damaged or caught in a bad position. As we get into the late Bronze Age, the region was in the midst of a chariot arms race. And then the Sea Peoples came.
And how did they defeat the chariot? What's the strategy?
Unlike the Bronze Age civilizations of Western Asia, the Sea Peoples fought on foot. Instead of using spearmen and archers to form a defensive shield for their chariots, the Sea Peoples wielded long swords and javelins, and they fought with an unmatched aggression. I've seen the Sea Peoples described as skirmishers, but I don't think that quite covers it. A much better word I've seen used is runners. The Sea Peoples were runners. They were highly mobile and weren't locked down into tight little groups like the spearmen were. Instead, their way of fighting was to explode outwards in unexpected bursts.
I guess that's probably the best way to deal with the chariots. Yeah, I mean, don't just advance slowly or something. Just run up to them. Sure, they're on horse, but maybe the time it takes to turn around, you might catch up and manage to like kill the horse or something.
This fact made the Sea Peoples chariot killers. The whole reason a chariot was effective was that they could outrun a person on foot. But was the same true of 10 people? 100 people?
Yeah.
What if they were coming at them from different directions?
Yeah.
What if they got cut off from the main group? chariots couldn't exactly turn on a dime, so it only took one wrong move.
It's always interesting, like there's always like some strategy or some weapon in history that seems like so perfect, it does so well, but there's always a counter. Like I think of, in the American War or the Napoleonic War, like this was the era of like the tightly packed ranks, everybody like in a line, shoot forward to do the most damage, and all of the army do that basically. So like it's kind of fair in a sense. But as soon as someone doesn't do that, for example, like the in Russia, what was it? The horse archer of the steppe, who don't really like follow the normal rules. I forget the name. But basically, yeah, they wouldn't do that. They would just like like ride around, just slowly pick one by one by one by one, and so like none of the usual strategy of the army of the time really worked against them. Or like in the American wars, like the rebels, same thing. So yeah, it's interesting how like it seems so OP, but there's always a counter, right? There's always a counter.
For the Sea People's runners to overwhelm and destroy a chariot. And like I said, the loss of a single chariot was catastrophic. The defensive line of spearmen and archers were supposed to protect against something like this, but in practice, the highly mobile Sea Peoples were able to get behind their lines quite easily.
I mean, that really shows, I guess that's, when different culture fight, right? Like, I guess these people with the chariot, they were so used to fighting, like, people who basically did the same thing. So, like, they were only prepared to fight that. But if they fight people who do a totally different strategy, it doesn't work. It totally doesn't work. I mean, another example, as always, I have to bring Napoleon as a French. When Napoleon went to Egypt, the first battles against, like, the Mamluk, all they did was, like, get into infantry square, and the Mamluk, charging with their horse, they could not even get close. And it ended up being, like 50 casualty for the French against like thousands for like the Mamluk, because again, the Mamluk were probably just used to battle of like you charge with your horse and your infantry and that's about it. But against like a square of like guns and cannons, what can you do? So it is interesting how like so many countries seems to just almost forget how to fight because they just get used to only fighting like the same type of strategy as them. It's only like preparing like a counter for a specific type of fighting, I guess.
As a response to these new tactics, defensive lines grew and grew and grew. It appears that by the end of this period, the armies facing off against the Sea Peoples were 10 times larger than they were at the beginning.
Just make a wall. We've got to build a wall.
As I said before, towards the end of this period, Egypt was pretty much the last state standing. Virtually all of its neighbors had fallen to the Sea Peoples. The inscription at Medinet Habu depicts the final battle against the Sea Peoples at the mouth of the Nile. Look at how the inscription emphasizes how large the Egyptian army had become. Here's a row of spearmen, and then a row of archers, and here's the pharaoh Ramses III personally leading the battle, standing on the bodies of his enemies. And then of course, here's the mighty chariot, prominently displayed, but not playing a decisive role in the battle. Clearly, the bulk of the fighting was among the spearmen and the archers. In writing, we are told that the Egyptians protected the mouth of the Nile by making a wall out of ships, each loaded with archers.
It's always a wall.
We're also told that every spearman in Egypt was in position and waiting for the Sea Peoples to land on shore. The inscription at Medinet Habu tells us the final result of the battle. Here are some Sea Peoples taken captive and being led away. Here is some unspeakable carnage.
Yeah, that looks crazy.
Of course, this is a piece of Egyptian propaganda, but we have no reason to doubt that this was the result. After so many incredible successes, the Sea Peoples were finally defeated in Egypt.
Alright.
But even in victory...
The moral of the story is just camp. Yeah, like camp the shore and wait for them. Makes sense.
Egypt suffered. From this moment forward, Egypt was a second-rate power, and even after 1,000 years, it had not yet fully recovered. The fact that Egypt was so badly damaged by the collapse of international trade is a clue. There has to be more to the story than the Sea Peoples.
Right. Tell me about it.
Scholars have been pulling at this thread for the last couple of decades, and the evidence is convincing. Bronze Age civilizations needed bronze, obviously. Without a constant supply, many of their cutting-edge technologies began to deteriorate. Bronze is made by combining 9 parts copper with
3,000 years
1
ago.
part tin. Copper is a relatively common metal, but it's difficult to mine. Most of these
different
Bronze
one this
Age
time.
civilizations had their own small mining operations, but the real action was in Cyprus. Cyprus was absolutely swimming in copper, and mining
I was gonna
it
ask
was
like something maybe stupid. I know a lot of like country name, but I don't know if they're, you know, I don't know where they are or stuff like that. I know there's a country called Cyprus today, isn't it? I thought it was like on land, or is it really like still to this day this island country Cyprus? I don't really know. I thought it was like some small country in Europe or something.
dead easy. This transformed the island into a fabulously wealthy hub of international trade. That brings us to tin. Tin is funny because it's actually extremely rare, and it's not evenly distributed across the earth. There was a tiny tin mine in Anatolia, controlled by the Hittites, but it didn't produce nearly enough to supply the entire region. After that, there weren't many options. The next closest major source was all the way over in modern Afghanistan, more than 3,000 kilometers away. You can just imagine how expensive and dangerous it was to haul tin all the way from Afghanistan to Cyprus.
Yeah.
There were alternative sources, but
Greek
it was
Cyprus
tough.
and Turkish Cyprus.
There was a smaller mine in Italy and another small mine in Spain, but these alone couldn't meet demand. There wasn't another deposit on the scale of the Afghanistan mine until you get all the way up to Cornwall on the island of Britain. It might shock you to learn that people actually made this trip. It was a risky voyage, but if you made it back, it was worth it.
Alright.
So as you can see, any disruption to this supply chain meant that it was no longer possible for Bronze Age civilizations to produce bronze, which by very definition was a problem.
So the point was just a finite resource.
So the argument goes that the Sea People's attacks disrupted international trade, slowed down the production of bronze, and weakened every state in the region. It was a vicious cycle. More attacks meant less trade.
Actually, that makes the most sense. Yeah. That's a good explanation. Like, they basically got rich and great and all that from, like, a resource, but then they can't get that resource anymore, so... Yeah, they just start perishing. That makes a lot of sense. That explains it.
Trade. Less trade made everybody even more vulnerable to additional attacks. As the Bronze Age states collapsed, the situation grew even more dire. But there might have been more to this story. Even if you put the whole international trade angle to the side, this entire region may have been much weaker than it seemed. According to experts, the migration of the Sea Peoples coincided with a 50-year period where Western Asia was riddled with massive earthquakes. I'm no scientist, but that seems bad. It's possible that these earthquakes were absolutely wrecking the economy.
I'm sure
in the
it would be, yeah.
Some of the cities that were abandoned for mysterious reasons may have in fact been abandoned after a seismic event. There's at least some evidence of earthquakes destroying cities in Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus. Greece seems to have got the worst of it.
Damn.
Egypt got off easy, which is an interesting fact, considering that they were the only major state left standing.
Yeah.
Maybe the earthquakes played a role.
Yeah, seems like it. Okay,
So,
interesting.
what brought the Sea Peoples here? For a long time, scholars guessed that some kind of famine in northern Europe caused a domino effect of southward migrations, culminating with the Sea Peoples packing up and fleeing across the Mediterranean Sea. This always made sense on paper, but there was very little evidence to support this theory until now. We now know that around this time, there was some kind of environmental emergency. It turns out that, as expected, Northern Europe was badly affected by this, which would have caused that domino effect. But the surprising thing is that the effects were even more severe in the eastern Mediterranean. We now have ancient pollen samples from northern Syria, which seem to point toward a dry event lasting for 300 years, beginning just before the Bronze Age collapse. Pollen samples have also been taken from Cyprus, where things were even worse. These samples indicate that environmental changes were so severe in Cyprus that there was no longer enough rainfall to sustain even basic agricultural activity. This would have been catastrophic.
Yeah,
it may
especially like
explain
Lithuania
why
and
some
London.
of the cities were abandoned before the Sea Peoples even came. Similar things have been found in the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece. In fact, in Greece there's evidence that over hundreds of years, plants were evolving to survive a desert-like environment. Some of the letters we find in the city of Ugarit support this finding. Apparently, during one of the invasions, there were crop failures across the entire Hittite
Yeah, so
Empire.
it's really like a combination
One
of
letter
things.
from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit makes
Wasn't
an
just their
urgent
week.
request for grain, ending with, "It is a matter of life and death." There's another letter from the nearby city of Emar, written during one of the later invasions. It reads, "There is famine in our house. We will all die of hunger. If you do not quickly arrive here, we ourselves will die of hunger."
But then, so they explained why the sea people had such an easy time for the most part defeating, those countries who had like so much problems. But then I guess for the sea people it wasn't great either. They came here and there was probably barely anything to do it in the end.
You will not see a living soul from your land. If these reports of environmental emergency are true, and we think they are, the Bronze Age civilizations may have been in a state of crisis before the Sea Peoples even arrived.
Okay. Possible,
The
yeah.
best current analysis of the Bronze Age collapse has landed on something called the systems collapse theory. According to the systems collapse theory, the arrival of the Sea Peoples was actually a medium-level threat. Under normal circumstances, the Bronze Age civilizations should have been able to fight
got
them
so many
off,
debuffs.
but they weren't living under normal circumstances. Changes to the climate had resulted in widespread famine across the region. This resulted in the depopulation of key cities. The famine and the depopulation then led to internal instability, where some local populations rose up and overthrew their ruling classes. We have evidence that this happened with some frequency over this period, especially in Greece. These factors, and the invasion of the Sea Peoples, caused a collapse in the international trade system, which just made everything all the worse. Oh yeah, and the region was absolutely riddled with earthquakes. The Bronze Age civilizations in Western Asia were dealing with 5 crises at once, with each
too many
crisis
debuffs.
creating a
Makes sense
multiplier
why
effect
they
on
couldn't
all
fight
the other
back.
ones. And then the Sea Peoples came.
That's the way to put it.
We still don't fully understand how or why the Bronze Age abruptly collapsed, and perhaps we never will, but the systems collapse theory is pretty good. One thing that I will point out is that for all of its clever work collecting pollen samples and studying ancient seismology, the systems collapse theory does slightly de-emphasize the destruction wrought upon Bronze Age civilizations. The fact that countless cities were destroyed is undeniable. We have the physical evidence.
Yeah.
The systems collapse theory argues that less of these were destroyed by the Sea Peoples than originally thought. And this might be right. We have all that evidence of environmental changes and earthquakes, but we don't know for sure. Scholarship in this area is still ongoing. There have
sure
been
it will be for a long
significant
time, yeah.
breakthroughs just within the last 10 years. We may see some definitive answers in our lifetimes.
That'd be cool.
But for now, we
That'd
don't
be
know.
cool.
We see the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, but when it comes to the root cause, all we have are theories.
Just a game theory. Okay, I mean, yeah, I guess it makes some sense, I think for the most part, whenever like a civilization collapse, there might be like one big reason, but there's always a bunch of reasons of different importance.
Upon closer
but
examination,
I
I
guess it
think
wouldn't be
these
just
guys
one
are still
thing.
alive, and I think they're licking somebody's foot.
Okay,
Nasty.
damn, they were kinky back then. Pretty interesting. Really interesting. I mean, yeah, I'm a scientist and I have no more information than the video told me, but I would agree, it's probably a combination of a lot of things. And it's pretty interesting, but that makes you think, like, yeah, the sea people came, and then, I guess they got defeated in Egypt eventually, but even then, yeah, like, they probably didn't really win much by coming. There was probably not much to loot or anything. And yeah, just looting what the already very little there is will just lead to absolute annihilation for the remaining people of those countries. So that makes some sense, yeah. Really interesting.